Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of northern Montana. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The winters in Montana Territory in the 1880s were known to be particularly brutal. The wind would howl through the mountain passes, carrying with it not just snow and ice, but a silence that seemed to consume everything in its path. It was during one such winter, specifically January of 1883, when the residents of Whitefish Valley first encountered Matthias Blackwood. No one knew where exactly Matthias had come from. Some said he'd ventured north from Wyoming Territory. Others claimed he'd crossed over from the Dakota Territory. A few even whispered he might have come down from Canada. Regardless of his origins, what everyone could agree upon was that Matthias was an exceptional trapper. At least, that's what they all initially believed. Whitefish Valley was a small but growing settlement in those days. The Great Northern Railway had not yet reached the area, but rumors of its coming had already drawn a modest community of hardy souls, willing to brave the harsh Montana winters. The settlement consisted of approximately 27 cabins scattered along the edges of the frozen Whitefish Lake, a general store run by Harlan Powell and his wife Beatrice, a small sawmill operated by the Johansen brothers, and a saloon that doubled as the only reliable meeting place for the community. It was at this saloon, named simply The Lodge, where the story of Matthias Blackwood and his peculiar trade truly begins. According to the handwritten accounts preserved in the Whitefish County Historical Archives, Matthias first appeared at the lodge on a particularly bitter January evening in 1883. The temperature had dropped well below zero, and the few men who had ventured out that night were huddled close to the iron stove that struggled to keep the establishment warm. The door to the saloon opened with a gust of frigid air, and in stepped a figure so completely covered in furs that at first the patrons couldn't tell if it was a man or a bear. The newcomer shed his outer layers, revealing a tall, gaunt man with a beard so thick and wild it nearly obscured his entire face. Only his eyes were clearly visible, described in multiple accounts as unusually pale, almost colorless, by those who encountered him. Harlan Powell, who owned both the general store and kept meticulous journals of daily life in the settlement, wrote, "The stranger introduced himself as Matthias Blackwood, a trapper who had established a cabin some miles north of our settlement, deep in the woods where the game was still plentiful. He spoke little of his past and even less of his present circumstances, but he did mention he would be bringing furs to trade come morning." True to his word, Matthias appeared at Powell's store the following day with a sled loaded with pelts. By all accounts, they were of exceptional quality: beaver, marten, fox, and other common furs of the region. What caught Powell's attention, however, was a separate bundle that Matthias kept apart from the others. When Powell inquired about it, Matthias simply said they were specialty pelts for a particular buyer in Helena. The transaction was completed. Matthias obtained necessary supplies and then disappeared back into the wilderness. For the next month, this became a pattern. Every 10 days or so, Matthias would emerge from the forest with a fresh collection of pelts, conduct his business quietly and efficiently, and then vanish again. The people of Whitefish grew accustomed to his presence, though few ever engaged him in extended conversation. It wasn't until late February that the first unsettling rumors began to circulate. Josiah Hudson, a local hunter, claimed to have stumbled upon Matthias's cabin while tracking a wounded elk. In the lodge, after several whiskeys, Josiah described what he had seen. The cabin itself was ordinary enough, though larger than you'd expect for a solitary man. It was what surrounded the cabin that gave me pause. There were no animal carcasses, no stretching frames for the pelts, none of the usual signs you'd expect around a trapper's dwelling. Instead, there were strange contraptions fashioned from wood and metal, the purpose of which I couldn't begin to guess. Josiah's account might have been dismissed as the ramblings of a man too fond of whiskey had it not been for what happened next. In early March, a fur buyer from Helena named Lawrence Merritt arrived in Whitefish, specifically looking for Matthias Blackwood. According to Powell's journal entry from March 7, 1883, Mr. Merritt inquired extensively about Blackwood, expressing particular interest in what he called the special merchandise, poilus. When I informed him that Blackwood had been keeping certain pelts separate from his regular trade goods, Merritt seemed unsurprised, but would not elaborate further. The fur buyer took a room at the modest boarding house run by Widow Hollister and waited for Matthias's next appearance. 3 days later, Matthias arrived with his usual shipment of furs, plus the mysterious separate bundle. Merritt and Matthias met privately in the back room of the lodge. No one knows what transpired during their meeting, but both men departed the settlement the following morning, Merritt returning to Helena and Matthias to his remote cabin. It was 2 weeks later when the first person disappeared. Martha Johansson, wife of the younger Johansson brother, vanished while gathering early spring herbs at the forest edge. A search party was organized, but the only trace they found was her basket, abandoned near a rarely used trail that led north, in the direction of Matthias Blackwood's cabin. The men of Whitefish debated whether to confront Matthias, but with no evidence beyond the location of the basket, they decided to continue searching elsewhere. 3 days later, before any decision about Matthias could be reached, he appeared at Powell's store as usual, with his furs and his separate bundle. Powell later wrote, "I found myself studying Blackwood more carefully today. There was nothing obviously different about his manner or appearance, yet something seemed changed. The bundle of specialty pelts appeared larger than usual. When I commented on this, he merely stated that hunting had been good. He departed quickly, declining my offer of coffee, saying he expected another snowstorm and wanted to reach his cabin before it hit." A week after Martha's disappearance, a second person went missing, Zachary Norris, a young man who worked at the sawmill. Like Martha, he had been alone when he vanished, having volunteered to deliver a load of cut timber to a homestead a few miles south of the settlement. His wagon and horses were found on the road, the timber still loaded, but Zachary was nowhere to be found. The pattern was becoming clear, and the people of Whitefish grew increasingly suspicious, yet they had no concrete evidence linking Matthias to the disappearances. That changed in early April, when Sebastian Hollister, son of the widow Hollister who ran the boarding house, decided to follow Matthias after one of his visits to the settlement. According to the official report filed by Thaddeus Ashcroft, who served as the nearest thing to a lawman in Whitefish at that time, Sebastian Hollister returned to the settlement in a state of extreme distress 2 days after following Blackwood into the wilderness. He claimed to have observed Blackwood entering his cabin with his sled of furs. Hollister concealed himself in the surrounding forest and waited. During the night, he heard unusual sounds emanating from the cabin, not animal noises, but something he described as mechanical in nature, like the working of some strange apparatus. Before dawn, Hollister crept closer to the cabin and peered through a gap in the shuttered window. What Sebastian Hollister claimed to have seen was so disturbing that initially few believed him. He described a large room dominated by a series of wooden frames and metal contraptions. Hanging from these frames were what appeared at first glance to be animal pelts in various stages of processing. Upon closer inspection, however, Hollister realized that what he was seeing were not animal skins at all. They had a peculiar quality to them, Ashcroft's report continued, quoting Hollister, too smooth, too uniform in texture. And the shapes were wrong, too large for any animal native to these parts. It was only when I saw him working on a fresh one that I understood what I was looking at. I couldn't watch any more. I fled. Hollister refused to explicitly state what he believed the pelts to be. But the implication was clear enough that Ashcroft organized a group of armed men to investigate Matthias's cabin. They departed the following morning, 10 men in total, all experienced woodsmen familiar with the territory. Only 7 returned. The official report, preserved in the territorial records now housed in the Montana Historical Society archives in Helena, is notably sparse in its details. It confirms that the group located Matthias Blackwood's cabin, finding it apparently abandoned. Inside, they discovered evidence of unusual activities inconsistent with normal trapping operations. The report mentions specialized equipment of unknown purpose and materials of questionable origin, but provides no specific descriptions. What the official report omits, the personal accounts fill in. Harlan Powell's journal entry from April 12, 1883, reads, "The men returned from Blackwood's cabin today, 3 fewer than departed. They brought with them several items found in the cabin, including a journal written in what appears to be some form of cipher or code, tools unlike any I've seen before, and a series of diagrams depicting what might be a process of some kind. Of the missing men, they found no trace. Of Blackwood himself, likewise no sign." The most telling account comes from Josiah Hudson, who was part of the expedition. In a letter to his brother in Minnesota dated April 20, 1883, he wrote, "What we found in that remote cabin haunts me still. I cannot bring myself to describe it in full, but I will say this: Blackwood was no ordinary trapper. The pelts he traded were not taken from any woodland creature. The specialized equipment we discovered appeared designed for a singular purpose: the careful removal and preservation of human skin." The separate room behind the main cabin contained 3 wooden frames, each bearing what remained of Harold Peterson, Otto Johansson, and James McAllister. They were conscious when we found them, though how they remained alive in such a condition defies comprehension. They did not survive the journey back to town. Of the missing women and young Zachary, we found only what Blackwood had already processed, stretched, tanned, and prepared for sale. News of what had been discovered spread rapidly through the settlement, causing near panic. Thaddeus Ashcroft organized another, larger party to hunt for Matthias Blackwood, but they found no trace of him. It was as if he had vanished into the wilderness as completely as the morning mist on Whitefish Lake. The story might have ended there, a horrific incident in a remote Montana settlement, eventually forgotten as the years passed. However, 2 months after Matthias disappeared from Whitefish, a fur trader matching his description appeared in a small settlement near present-day Bonners Ferry, Idaho. According to records preserved in the Boundary County Historical Society, this trader, who called himself Jeremiah Caldwell, brought with him pelts of exceptional quality, and notably, a separate bundle of what he called specialty merchandise, shrey. 2 residents of that settlement disappeared during the month the trader known as Jeremiah Caldwell remained in the area. He departed suddenly, leaving no forwarding information. 6 weeks later, a similar figure appeared in a mining camp in eastern Washington Territory, following the same pattern: exceptional furs, mysterious separate merchandise, unexplained disappearances, and a sudden departure. Throughout the remainder of 1883 and into 1884, reports of a tall, bearded trapper with similar trading patterns and coincidental disappearances emerged from locations across the Pacific Northwest. The descriptions varied somewhat. Sometimes the man had a scar across his cheek. Sometimes he walked with a slight limp. Sometimes his beard was gray rather than dark. But the pattern remained consistent. In September 1884, a startling development occurred. Lawrence Merritt, the fur buyer from Helena who had met with Matthias Blackwood in Whitefish, was found dead in his office, according to the Helena Independent newspaper dated September 8, 1884. Mr. Lawrence Merritt, a prominent fur buyer known for his discerning eye and exclusive clientele, was discovered deceased in his office yesterday morning, The circumstances of his death have prompted an official investigation, as the scene reportedly displayed signs of violence and unusual mutilation. What the newspaper delicately referred to as unusual mutilation was, according to the coroner's report, the complete removal of Merritt's skin. More disturbing still was the discovery of a ledger among Merritt's possessions that contained coded entries dating back several years. When deciphered by a mathematics professor from the newly established College of Montana in Deer Lodge, the ledger revealed a network of buyers and sellers trading in what was euphemistically called anthropological specimens. The names included wealthy collectors from as far away as New York, San Francisco, and even Europe. The discovery prompted a multi-jurisdictional investigation that eventually uncovered a shadowy market for human remains, specifically preserved human skin. According to an 1886 report by Pinkerton detective Raymond Walsh, who was hired by the Montana territorial government to investigate the case, the trade in these grizzly artifacts appears to cater to a small but financially significant clientele of collectors fascinated by what they term human variations. These individuals, typically of substantial means and social standing, collect preserved human skin specimens displaying interesting markings such as tattoos, unusual pigmentation, or scarring. The more rare or unique the specimen, the higher its value in this illicit market. The investigation identified several suppliers for this macabre trade, operating independently across the Western Territories. Matthias Blackwood, it seemed, was just one of several individuals harvesting human skin for profit. What set him apart, according to Detective Walsh's report, was the quality of his product. Witness accounts consistently note the exceptional preservation techniques employed by the suspect known variously as Blackwood, Caldwell, or Thorne. Unlike other suppliers who typically harvest from the already deceased, evidence suggests Blackwood developed methods to remove large sections of skin while keeping the victim alive, resulting in specimens of superior flexibility and durability. The investigation ultimately identified 17 disappearances across Montana, Idaho, Washington, and Oregon territories that fit the pattern associated with Matthias Blackwood. The actual number of victims was likely much higher, as many remote settlements kept poor records and solitary prospectors or trappers could vanish without anyone filing an official report. Despite the extensive investigation, Matthias Blackwood himself was never apprehended. The last confirmed sighting placed him in a logging camp near Astoria, Oregon, in early 1886. After that, the trail went cold. Some speculated he had moved on to California or perhaps returned to Canada. Others believed he may have been killed by one of his intended victims or perished in the wilderness. A few even suggested he had accumulated enough wealth from his grizzly trade to retire to a life of anonymous comfort in some distant city. Whatever became of Matthias Blackwood, his legacy lived on in the nightmares of those who encountered him and in the cautionary tales told throughout the Northwest. The investigation into the trade network he supplied continued for several more years, resulting in the arrest and conviction of 3 collectors and 2 other suppliers. Lawrence Merritt's client list led to several prominent individuals quietly leaving their communities under clouds of suspicion, though many escaped formal charges due to their wealth and influence. In 1895, a curious footnote was added to the Blackwood case. A private museum in San Francisco was destroyed in a fire, and among the artifacts lost was a collection of what the insurance claim described as ethnographic skin specimens of North American origin. The museum's owner, Julian Whitmore, had been on Detective Walsh's list of suspected collectors but had never been formally charged. The fire was ruled accidental, though some speculated it might have been set deliberately to destroy evidence. The most unsettling epilogue to the story came in 1901, when renovation work on a building in Helena that had once housed Lawrence Merritt's fur trading business uncovered a hidden room containing several wooden frames similar to those described in the Whitefish cabin, along with specialized tools and chemical supplies. Most disturbing of all was a leather-bound journal written in the same cipher found in Blackwood's cabin. When translated, it revealed that Merritt had not merely been a middleman in the human skin trade, he had been Blackwood's teacher. According to the journal, Merritt had learned the techniques for human skin preservation during his time as a medical orderly during the Civil War, where he had observed surgeons performing skin grafts and had access to anatomical texts. After the war, he had discovered there was a market for preserved human skin among certain wealthy collectors fascinated by anthropology and the emerging field of criminal science. Initially, Merritt harvested from the already deceased casualties of the frontier's harsh conditions, but as demand grew for higher quality specimens, he began experimenting with harvesting from living subjects. Matthias Blackwood, whose real name was never discovered, had apparently apprenticed with Merritt for several years before establishing his own operation in northern Montana. The journal suggested there were at least 3 other apprentices trained by Merritt operating throughout the Western Territories and possibly beyond. The final verified document related to the case is a telegram sent from the sheriff of a small town in Northern California to the Helena Territorial Authorities in 1904. It reads simply, "Man-matching Blackwood description found deceased stop appears to have died of natural causes. Stop no identification. Found stop. Notable feature extensive scarring consistent with partial flaying of skin stop." Whether this was indeed the remains of Matthias Blackwood is impossible to verify with certainty. If it was him, there is a certain poetic justice in the fact that his body showed evidence of having been partially subjected to the same treatment he had inflicted on so many others. How he received such injuries and yet survived long enough to die of apparently natural causes remains one of the many unanswered questions in this disturbing case. The story of Matthias Blackwood and his grizzly trade faded from public memory as the frontier era gave way to the 20th century. The records gathered dust in historical society archives, occasionally rediscovered by researchers looking into frontier crimes or the darker aspects of medical history. In 1952, a doctoral student at the University of Montana named Harrison Miles stumbled upon the case while researching frontier justice systems. His dissertation, titled "The Commerce of Human Remains on the American Frontier, 1865–1900, devoted a chapter to the Blackwood case. However, the dissertation was deemed too disturbing and potentially sensationalistic by Miles's advisors and was significantly edited before being accepted. The original manuscript was archived and largely forgotten. It wasn't until 1967 that the full story resurfaced when author Nathaniel Rhodes discovered Miles's original manuscript while researching a book on unusual crimes of the American West. Rhodes conducted additional research, tracking down aging descendants of Whitefish residents and examining records in multiple historical societies across Montana, Idaho, and Washington. His book, The Skinner of the Northern Woods, The True Story of Matthias Blackwood, was published in a limited edition by a small press specializing in historical crime narratives. The book received little attention outside a small circle of true crime enthusiasts and frontier history specialists. What makes the Blackwood case particularly disturbing is not just the horrific nature of his crimes, but the revelation that he was part of a larger network trading in human remains, a network that included wealthy, respected individuals who collected preserved human skin as others might collect art or rare books. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about human nature and the thin veneer of civilization that sometimes fails to restrain our darkest impulses. The disappearance of the Blackwood case from public consciousness might be attributed to its exceptionally disturbing nature, or perhaps to the discomfort caused by acknowledging that such depravity could exist within supposedly civilized society. It's easier to relegate such cases to the realm of fiction, to tell ourselves that monsters like Matthias Blackwood are merely the creation of imaginative writers rather than real historical figures who walk the same streets and breathe the same air as our ancestors. Yet the archived records remain, bearing silent witness to a chapter in American frontier history that most would prefer to forget. The faded journal entries, official reports, personal letters, and newspaper clippings tell a story far more terrifying than any fictional account, precisely because it actually happened. In the years since Rhodes' book, the story has occasionally resurfaced in specialized historical journals or as a brief mention in broader works on frontier crime. In 1996, a collection of supposedly authentic artifacts from the Blackwood case was offered for auction in Seattle. The lot included tools alleged to have been recovered from Blackwood's cabin, pages from Merritt's journal, and most disturbingly, a small framed section of preserved skin of uncertain origin. The auction was halted after protests from historical preservation societies and ethical concerns about the provenance and nature of the items. The collection was instead donated to the Montana Historical Society on the condition that it would remain in secure storage, available only to qualified researchers with legitimate academic purposes. Today, the sites associated with the Blackwood case bear little resemblance to their 1880s counterparts. Whitefish has grown from a small frontier settlement to a popular resort town. The location where Matthias Blackwood's cabin once stood is now part of a national forest, the exact spot long reclaimed by the wilderness. Helena has transformed from a territorial capital to a modern city. The building that once housed Lawrence Merritt's fur trading business was demolished in the 1950s to make way for new development. Yet something of the case's dark essence lingers in these places. Forest rangers in the Whitefish area occasionally report receiving inquiries from visitors about the exact location of the Blackwood cabin, though such information is not provided out of respect for the victims and to prevent macabre tourism. The Montana Historical Society periodically fields requests to view the Blackwood collection, most of which are denied due to the sensitive nature of the materials. Every few years, a new book or article appears, examining some aspect of the case or claiming to offer new insights or information. Perhaps the most telling legacy of Matthias Blackwood and his grizzly trade is how it continues to unsettle us more than a century later. In an era when the worst aspects of human behavior are routinely displayed in media and entertainment, the calculated commercial nature of Blackwood's atrocities still has the power to disturb. It serves as a reminder that the capacity for calculated cruelty has always existed within humanity, needing only the right circumstances and the absence of restraining influences to manifest. The wilderness around Whitefish remains beautiful, but somehow haunted, not by supernatural presences, but by the knowledge of what once transpired there. The wind still howls through the mountain passes in winter, carrying with it not just snow and ice, but the echo of a history most would prefer to forget. In that howling wind, some say they can almost hear the mechanical sounds described by Sebastian Hollister, the working of strange apparatus in a remote cabin where a man methodically transformed human beings into merchandise to satisfy the macabre desires of wealthy collectors. And perhaps most unsettling of all is the knowledge that while Matthias Blackwood eventually disappeared, the dark impulses that drove him and his customers have never truly vanished. They remain dormant, waiting for the right conditions to emerge once again, reminding us that the most terrifying monsters are not the supernatural creatures of fiction, but the all-too-real human beings who walk among us, hiding their true natures behind masks of normalcy. In the final entry of his journal, dated just before his death, Lawrence Merritt wrote a passage that serves as a fitting epitaph for the entire sordid affair. We have created something that will outlive us all. Long after our names are forgotten, the work will continue. The collection grows, preserved for all time, a secret testament to what men are capable of when freed from the constraints of conventional morality. Every specimen tells a story, not just of the individual from whom it was harvested, but of our own insatiable curiosity and the lengths to which we will go to satisfy it. Is that not the true legacy of humanity? Not our compassion or our creativity, but our willingness to transgress every boundary in pursuit of knowledge, profit, or merely novel sensation. In that sense, perhaps we are the most terrifying creatures to have ever walked this earth. The most disturbing aspect of the Blackwood case may be not that it happened, but that it could happen again. The wilderness has receded, the frontier has closed, but the dark corners of human nature remain unexplored and dangerous territory. As long as there are people willing to view others as merely resources to be harvested, and as long as there are those whose wealth and privilege allow them to indulge in the most depraved desires without consequence, the specter of Matthias Blackwood and his grisly trade will continue to haunt the collective consciousness of the American West. But the story of Matthias Blackwood goes deeper still. What many accounts fail to mention is the elaborate system of preservation Blackwood developed, a macabre innovation that made his specimens particularly valuable to collectors. According to notes found in his cabin and later deciphered, Blackwood had developed a proprietary chemical solution that prevented the harvested skin from deteriorating, while maintaining its flexibility and natural appearance. The formula, written in his cipher, contained ingredients common to taxidermy, but also several substances that remained unidentified by the chemists who later examined it. This chemical innovation was what allowed Blackwood to command premium prices from his clients. While other suppliers in the grizzly trade offered preserved human skin that was stiff, discolored, or prone to cracking with age, Blackwood's specimens reportedly retained an uncanny lifelike quality for years. According to Detective Walsh's report, one collector described Blackwood's work as possessing a vitality that makes one momentarily forget its macabre origin. The market for such specimens was surprisingly extensive. Beyond the wealthy private collectors who kept their acquisitions hidden in private studies or secret rooms, there existed a shadow network of medical schools, anatomical museums, and scientific societies that would purchase such items under the guise of educational purposes. The line between legitimate scientific interest and macabre fascination was often blurred, especially in the late 19th century when the boundaries of scientific inquiry were still being defined. This murky ethical territory was exploited by men like Lawrence Merritt, who maintained connections in both worlds. The legitimate fur trade that served as his public business and the clandestine commerce in human remains that was his true source of wealth. His client list, partially recovered from his coded ledger, included not just the expected wealthy eccentrics, but also respected physicians, university professors, and at least one prominent museum curator. The investigation into this network was hampered by the social standing of many of those involved. Local authorities in territories like Montana and Idaho were often reluctant to pursue charges against influential citizens, especially when the evidence was circumstantial, or the victims were from the margins of society, drifters, prospectors, or individuals whose disappearances might otherwise go unremarked. This reluctance to fully investigate the network allowed it to continue operating long after Blackwood himself had vanished from the scene. According to Detective Walsh's final report on the case, submitted in 1889 but only recently discovered in the archives of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, it is my professional assessment that while we have identified several participants in this repugnant trade, they represent merely the visible portion of a much larger organization. The evidence suggests a systematic operation spanning multiple territories and states. with connections extending to the East Coast and possibly overseas. The scale of this enterprise indicates a demand far greater than what one might reasonably expect for such grisly merchandise. One of the most chilling aspects of the case emerged in 1892 when a wealthy San Francisco businessman named Victor Cranston was arrested for unrelated financial crimes. During the search of his mansion, authorities discovered a hidden room containing what was described in the police report as an extensive collection of preserved human specimens displayed in a manner consistent with a museum or gallery. Most disturbing was the discovery that Cranston had commissioned detailed provenance documentation for each specimen, including the name, age, and origin of the individual from whom it had been harvested. This documentation revealed that many of the victims had not been random selections, but had been specifically chosen for particular physical attributes: unusual scarring, distinctive pigmentation, or unique markings such as tattoos. Some entries even included photographs of the individuals taken before their deaths, suggesting a level of premeditation that transformed these crimes from opportunistic harvesting to calculated hunting. The Cranston case offered a rare glimpse into the mindset of the collectors who drove the demand for Blackwood's grisly merchandise. Cranston's personal journals, seized during the investigation, revealed a man who viewed his collection not as evidence of cruelty, but as a scientific achievement. He wrote at length about the anthropological significance of his collection, and seemed genuinely unable to comprehend why others might find it disturbing. Each specimen represents a unique expression of the human form, Cranston wrote. In preserving these examples, I ensure that their distinctive qualities are not lost to time and decay. Is this not the same impulse that drives the naturalist to collect butterflies or the archaeologist to excavate ancient remains? I merely apply this scientific imperative to the study of human variation. This clinical detachment, this ability to rationalize the most horrific acts as contributions to knowledge or preservation of the unique, appears to have been common among the collectors identified in the investigation. They did not see themselves as complicit in murder, but as patrons of a specialized form of scientific preservation. This self-deception allowed them to maintain their public personas as respectable, often philanthropic members of society, while privately indulging in what one prosecutor described as the most profound perversion of the scientific impulse. The investigation into this network effectively ended in 1898, when federal authorities concluded that most of the active participants had either been arrested, had fled the country, or had gone underground so effectively as to be beyond reach. The case files were archived, and the matter was considered closed, despite Detective Walsh's insistence that the network remained operational, merely more cautious in its activities. There is evidence to suggest Walsh was correct. Throughout the early 20th century, there were sporadic reports from various parts of the country of individuals attempting to sell preserved human skin to private collectors or unscrupulous medical establishments. These cases were typically treated as isolated incidents rather than connected to a larger network, but the similarity in methods and clientele suggests that the trade Blackwood had once supplied continued in some form. The most recent confirmed connection to the Blackwood case came in 1962, when an elderly man named Howard Merritt died in Portland, Oregon. Among his possessions was a locked trunk containing documents that identified him as the grandson of Lawrence Merritt. The trunk also contained several journals written in the same cipher used by Blackwood and the elder Merritt, along with what appeared to be business records dating from the 1920s through the 1940s. When deciphered, these documents revealed that Howard Merritt had continued his grandfather's business well into the 20th century, though on a much smaller scale and with greater caution. Rather than harvesting from living victims, the younger Merritt appears to have sourced his specimens from morgues, medical schools, and funeral homes, using bribery and falsified documentation to obtain human skin that he then processed using his grandfather's methods. His client list was smaller, but no less disturbing. Wealthy collectors who maintained the tradition begun in the previous century, passing their macabre interests from one generation to the next, like some perverse family legacy. The most recent entry in Howard Merritt's ledger was dated 1958, suggesting that the trade continued well into the modern era, albeit in a form that had evolved to adapt to increased law enforcement scrutiny and changing social conditions. This revelation prompted a brief investigation by federal authorities, but with Howard Merritt deceased and most of his clients either dead or impossible to identify from his coded records, the matter was once again closed. The documents were sealed and eventually transferred to the FBI's archives of historical cases, where they remained largely forgotten until being rediscovered by researchers in the early 2000s. What makes the Blackwood case and its long aftermath so disturbing is not just the horrific nature of the crimes themselves, but the implication that such activities could continue largely undetected for decades, adapting to changing circumstances, but never truly ceasing. It suggests a persistent dark current flowing beneath the surface of civilized society, occasionally visible through incidents that break through to public awareness, but mostly remaining hidden, known only to those who participate in or investigate such matters. The modern incarnation of this trade, if it still exists, would bear little resemblance to Matthias Blackwood's frontier operation. Today's technology offers new methods of preservation, new ways to locate potential victims, and new channels for connecting buyers and sellers while maintaining anonymity. The dark web provides a marketplace where almost anything can be bought and sold if one knows where to look and has the resources to participate. Law enforcement agencies occasionally uncover cases that suggest the trade in human remains continues, not just archaeological specimens or medical teaching materials, but more recent acquisitions of questionable provenance. These cases are typically treated as isolated incidents, but the patterns sometimes echo those established more than a century ago by Blackwood and his contemporaries. The Montana Historical Society still maintains its sealed collection of artifacts from the Blackwood case, accessible only to qualified researchers with legitimate academic purposes. Among these items is a leather-bound journal recovered from Blackwood's cabin, written entirely in his personal cipher. Despite multiple attempts over the decades, only about 60% of this journal has been successfully translated. The remaining pages contain what one cryptographer described as a more complex variant of the cipher, possibly intended to conceal information of particular sensitivity. What secrets remained locked in that untranslated text? Instructions for Blackwood's preservation techniques? The names of clients or accomplices never identified in the official investigation? The locations of other operations similar to his own? These questions remain unanswered, the journal a silent witness to horrors that have never been fully revealed. In 2015, a graduate student in cryptography at Montana State University proposed using advanced computer algorithms to attempt a new translation of the untranslated portions of Blackwood's journal. The proposal was initially approved but was subsequently withdrawn after concerns were raised about the potential uses of such information if it did indeed contain detailed instructions for Blackwood's preservation techniques. Some knowledge, it was decided, was better left undiscovered. The legacy of Matthias Blackwood lives on in other ways as well. His case has become a fixture in courses on the history of crime in the American West, a cautionary tale about the dark possibilities that lurked in the shadows of frontier society. Criminologists study the case as an early example of a serial killer who combined pathological impulses with commercial motives, creating a unique and particularly disturbing criminal profile. For the residents of modern Whitefish, the Blackwood case is an uncomfortable piece of local history, rarely mentioned in tourist brochures or official histories, but known to most long-term residents. Occasionally, visitors with an interest in true crime or macabre history will inquire about the case, prompting brief, reluctant explanations from locals who would generally prefer not to dwell on this aspect of their town's past. The forest where Blackwood's cabin once stood has long since reclaimed the site. No physical trace remains of the structure or its grisly purpose, yet something of the horror lingers in that place, felt by those who venture there even without knowing its history. Forest rangers report that certain areas near the suspected location of the cabin are consistently avoided by wildlife. No birds nest there, no animals make their dens in the vicinity. It is as if the natural world itself remembers what happened there and maintains a respectful distance. This sense of lingering darkness extends beyond the physical location. The concept of Blackwood, the solitary figure emerging from the wilderness with his terrible merchandise, the calculated cruelty of his enterprise, the network of wealth and privilege that enabled and sustained it, has become a kind of archetypal fear, a manifestation of the danger that can hide behind a seemingly normal human face. In the words of Nathaniel Rhodes, whose 1967 book remains the most comprehensive account of the case, the true horror of Matthias Blackwood lies not in the gruesome details of his crimes, though these are disturbing enough. It lies in the recognition that he was not some inhuman monster, but a man who made choices, who developed skills, who built a business based on the systematic exploitation of human suffering. And perhaps most terrifying of all, he found willing customers for his grisly merchandise, individuals whose wealth and social position placed them above suspicion and allowed them to indulge their darkest impulses without consequence. If such things were possible then, in the supposedly simpler time of the American frontier, what equivalent horrors might exist in our modern world, hidden behind facades of respectability and justified by cold, clinical reasoning? It is a question that has no comfortable answer, a question that forces us to confront the darker possibilities of human nature and the shadowy corners of the society we have built. The story of Matthias Blackwood may be more than a century old, but the questions it raises about what lies beneath the surface of civilization remain as relevant and as unsettling as ever. The wind still howls through the mountain passes around Whitefish in winter, carrying with it not just snow and ice, but the whisper of a history most would prefer to forget. And in that whisper, those who listen closely might hear a warning that the capacity for calculated cruelty remains present in human nature, that the masks of normalcy can hide the most terrible truths, and that some trades, once established, never truly disappear but merely change their form to suit the times. The Montana Historical Society maintains a small, private collection of materials related to the Blackwood case that remains sealed to the general public. According to those few researchers who have been granted limited access, these materials include several artifacts recovered from Blackwood's cabin that were deemed too disturbing for public display or general research access. Among these items is a leather-bound book described as a customer catalog, a collection of human skin samples, each labeled with coded notations about their origin and particular qualities. This grisly sales tool apparently allowed Blackwood to show potential clients examples of his work without needing to transport larger specimens. The catalog includes notations in Blackwood's cipher that, when translated, reveal a pricing structure based on size, condition, and unusual characteristics of each specimen. Another disturbing item in the collection is a set of specialized tools designed specifically for the removal and preservation of human skin. These implements, crafted with precision that suggests medical or surgical training, include modified versions of conventional skinning knives, as well as entirely unique instruments whose purpose can only be guessed at. According to the catalog entry, these tools were custom-made to Blackwood specifications by a blacksmith in Helena, who believed they were specialized implements for taxidermy. Leake, perhaps most chilling, is a series of detailed anatomical drawings found among Blackwood's papers showing various regions of the human body with annotations about skin thickness, elasticity, and optimal harvesting techniques. These drawings demonstrate not just technical knowledge, but a methodical scientific approach to what most would consider unthinkable acts of cruelty. They suggest a mind capable of complete detachment from the humanity of his victims, viewing them merely as resources to be efficiently processed. The investigation into the network of collectors who purchased Blackwood's merchandise revealed a disturbing pattern in their backgrounds and interests. Many had formal medical or scientific training, but had abandoned legitimate careers for various reasons. Others were wealthy individuals with private museums or collections focused on anthropological or anatomical specimens. What they shared was a particular worldview that justified their actions through a distorted lens of scientific inquiry or preservation of the unique. Victor Cranston, the San Francisco businessman whose collection was discovered in 1892, maintained extensive correspondence with several other collectors. These letters, written in a private code, similar to but distinct from Blackwood's cipher, discussed their acquisitions in clinical, detached terms that deliberately obscured the human origin of their specimens. They compared notes on preservation techniques, complained about the difficulty of finding quality suppliers, and even arranged exchanges of items from their respective collections. This correspondence reveals a network that extended far beyond the Western territories, with connections to similar collectors in New York, Boston, London, and Paris. The European connection is particularly noteworthy, as it suggests that the trade Blackwood supplied had international dimensions, possibly linked to the colonial acquisitiveness that filled European museums with artifacts and remains from around the world during the 19th century. The investigation into this network was hampered not just by the social standing of those involved, but by jurisdictional issues and varying levels of commitment from local authorities. In some cases, evidence strongly suggests that bribes were paid to ensure that investigations were cut short or directed away from certain individuals. The full extent of the network was never mapped, and many participants likely escaped identification entirely. One particularly troubling aspect of the case emerged during the investigation of Lawrence Merritt's business records. According to Detective Walsh's report, Merritt had established connections with certain medical schools and research institutions that would purchase preserved human skin under the guise of educational materials. While some of these institutions may have been unaware of the true origin of these specimens, others appear to have been fully complicit, providing a veneer of scientific legitimacy to what was essentially a criminal enterprise. This academic connection allowed the trade to persist, even as public awareness of cases like Blackwood's might otherwise have curtailed it. By disguising their activities as contributions to medical education or scientific research, participants could continue their commerce in human remains while minimizing the risk of exposure or prosecution. This pattern continued well into the 20th century, with Howard Merritt's records indicating regular sales to certain medical establishments as late as the 1940s. The psychological profile of Matthias Blackwood himself remains a subject of debate among criminologists and historians who have studied the case. The limited personal writings recovered from his cabin provide few insights into his motivations or his perception of his own actions. Unlike many serial killers who leave manifestos or journals explaining their worldview, Blackwood's writings focus almost exclusively on technical aspects of his operation: preservation methods, business records, and coded communications with clients and suppliers. This absence of personal reflection has led some researchers to suggest that Blackwood may have been what modern psychology would classify as a pure sociopath, an individual utterly lacking in empathy or moral constraint, capable of committing the most horrific acts without emotional disturbance. Others argue that his methodical approach and business acumen suggest a more complex psychology, perhaps a person who had developed elaborate justifications for his actions that allowed him to reconcile them with some personal moral framework, however distorted. Dr. Vivian Harding, a forensic psychologist who studied the Blackwood case extensively during the 1990s, proposed a different interpretation. The evidence suggests that Blackwood did not kill out of personal gratification or compulsion, but as a calculated business decision. He identified a market demand and developed the skills and methods to supply it, approaching the entire enterprise with the detachment of a businessman rather than the frenzy of a typical serial killer. In some ways, this calculated commercialization of murder is more disturbing than crimes of passion or psychosis, as it suggests a complete commodification of human life, the ultimate expression of treating people as objects rather than beings. This commercial aspect of Blackwood's crimes sets him apart from many other serial killers in American history. He did not kill for personal gratification, religious delusion, or sexual compulsion, motives common among such criminals. Instead, he killed for profit, having identified a market niche that, however repugnant, offered substantial financial rewards to those willing to supply it. The network of wealthy collectors who purchased Blackwood's merchandise were equally culpable in these crimes, creating the demand that Blackwood and others like him worked to fulfill. Yet most of these individuals escaped justice entirely, protected by their wealth, social position, and the reluctance of authorities to pursue cases that might implicate prominent citizens. This disparity in accountability, with suppliers like Blackwood hunted as criminals while their wealthy clients remained largely untouched, reflects broader patterns of justice and power in American society that persist to the present day. It raises uncomfortable questions about who is held responsible for crimes when those crimes involve transactions between those with power and those without. The legacy of Matthias Blackwood and the network he supplied extends beyond the direct harm caused to his victims. It serves as a stark reminder of the potential for human cruelty when ordinary moral constraints are abandoned in pursuit of profit or prestige. It demonstrates how systems of commerce can develop around even the most repugnant activities if there is money to be made and willing participants at both ends of the transaction. Perhaps most disturbing is the recognition that the basic dynamics that enabled Blackwood's enterprise, the commodification of human beings, the exploitation of the vulnerable by the powerful, the use of wealth to insulate oneself from consequences, remain present in our modern world, albeit in different forms. The specifics of Blackwood's trade may belong to a bygone era, but the underlying patterns of exploitation and justification continue to manifest in contemporary society.